is you're going to have a particular plasma cell that has an abnormality, or a B cell that has an abnormality, and it's going to clone itself. And it's going to, I mean, they already clone themselves, but this time you have one that keeps making more and more and more, but it has a mutation within it, all right? Because when we're talking about any type of cancer, we're talking about mutations involved. Everybody good with that? So clone itself has abnormal genotype. So you end up getting a whole bunch of these cells, plasma cells, that have an abnormal genotype to them. And you have a whole bunch of them that end up making a whole bunch of the same antibody, okay? So just to kind of look at this in a graph format, if we were going to take someone's plasma, their blood, and then analyze the solutes or the proteins that are in that plasma, do like an electrophoresis for proteins now, all right? We would have most of what protein show up?
Lance Jones?
In just normal plasma. Albumin, right? Albumin is the big plasma protein here. So you have a lot of albumin. And then within that blood, you would have antibodies. And so I'm just going to 1, 2, 3, 4, that's how I'm just going to put them here. Antibodies. I mean, there's more proteins than these in the blood, but we're talking specifically about what's going on with this type of leukemia here. Now, up above is what you would see normally. You would see a big, huge peak with your albumin, because that's the most common protein. And then with these guys, you'd have a little bit of each of them. There wouldn't, not any particular one would be more than the other, okay? Now when we're talking about plasma cell leukemia, because you're getting this clone of one particular plasma cell that has this abnormal genotype, you're going to see that this antibody is going to skyrocket in a person that has this leukemia. So then this would look like this. So this would be abnormal and associated with plasma cell leukemia. The albumin would still be high. All the other antibodies would be, about the same. But then you have this one that's making more and more and more of itself and releasing all these antibodies. And so then you get this peak of those antibodies within the plasma. And so this is going to be a really good sign that somebody has this type of white blood cell malignancy. Everybody good with that? Now the other thing with plasma cell leukemia is it actually is going to form its tumor in bone tissue. And so since it's forming its tumor in bone tissue, what ends up happening to the bone is where you have this tumor, it starts to break down. And what is bone?
Calcium.
Yes, it's storing calcium. But now you're getting bone breaking down, so you hinder the ability as the bone to be this electrolyte pool, okay? So where does that calcium go? Into the blood. So now what electrolyte imbalance do we have? Hypercalcemia. So with plasma cell leukemia, because the tumor is in bone tissue, you're going to see breakdown of bone. And the release of calcium into the blood, which is hypercalcemia. All right,
So are you going to have a high activity of osteoclasts?
I think the reason why you have hypercalcemia isn't because of the action of the osteoclasts. It's because that bone that would normally be there to hold the calcium has a big tumor.
So
Okay.
it's different than multiple myeloma.
I have no idea about that,
Okay.
honestly. These are the ones, there's so much information with these white blood cell malignancies, and I'm showing you the stuff that stuck with me, which is the questions I'm gonna give you. It's the stuff that stuck with me.
Okay.
So, yeah. Other questions? Okay. Hypercalcemia, what does that lead to in regards to a manifestation? I'm gonna write it over here. We only talked about skeletal muscle big time with this, right?
Does it slow everything down? It slows, yeah.
So let's say this is inside a skeletal muscle fiber. Skeletal muscle fiber. And this is outside. Now you have a whole bunch more calcium out here, right? Is it more negative or positive inside? This is the cell membrane here. Negative. It's more negative because proteins tend to have a negative charge to them. And muscle has a lot of proteins, actin, myosin, these all have like negative charges. So you're gonna have more negative in here compared to out here. And when we're talking about separation of charge, you take a voltmeter and you stick it here and you see how far apart these balances are. And that's -7, because you're reading based on this, okay? Now, if you have more calcium out here, do you have a further separation of charge? Yes, right? Now this is like this. You have a further separation of charge here. Does that make it easier or harder to excite this muscle fiber? Harder. So, hypercalcemia leads to muscle weakness because of that. It's just an overall symptom that you'll see because the muscles are not as easy, they can't easily get excited to contract. So we're good with one. Okay. Now, the other cool thing, I always say cool thing because some of these things are pretty interesting, but you wouldn't necessarily want to be the person that is inflicted with these things. But when we're talking about an antibody, let's just think of it as the basic structure like this. Have you guys seen this before for the structure of an antibody? So, what happens is that, I'm going to draw a line here. So this part and this part of the antibody is variable depending upon what that B cell is going to identify as non-self. Everybody good with that? So this part is variable. Part in red. Then you're going to have this area here of the antibody that's constant. All right? Everybody good with that? Now you can see that you have what's called a long chain and a short chain. Can you guys see that now? So in plasma cell leukemia, you're going to start to get this buildup of what's called Benz Jones, okay, in the blood.
Is long chain and short chain interchangeable with light chain and heavy chain? Or is that
Yes.
different? Okay.
Exactly.
And then the plasma cell leukemia is myeloma as well, or is that different than the leukemia?
I believe it's the same. I
Okay.
just use leukemia. Okay, so built in. What am I saying here? Okay. Benz-Jones is this protein that's from this same antibody, but what ends up happening with this buildup of these antibodies in the blood, you start to see this short or light chain start to accumulate. And that's called the Benz-Jones protein. So this is referring to light chain of antibody. So we're just looking at this, we're talking about, talking about this building up, these things. Everybody good with that? Now this is building up in the blood, and you're gonna start to see that the kidneys want to get rid of it. But it's just so much. So what's going to ultimately happen with someone that has this particular white blood cell malignancy? What is a more severe manifestation?
Renal failure?
Kidney failure is going to be a later stage of this. There is no anaplasia here. It's just the simple fact that this plasma cell, there's a bunch of clones of it, and they're making the same antibody, and then you get an accumulation of those antibodies in the blood, and then those antibodies start to break down. You get this Benz protein. Of course, it's happening in the bone. And because it's happening in the bone, you have these other manifestations like hypercalcemia going on. And because those antibodies start to break down, the kidney is trying to get rid of it, and then you get kidney failure. Is everybody good with this one? Yes, Jessica?
What do you mean by light chain?
It's this purple part that is circled here. So this is an antibody. You have an antibody like this. It's this that builds up the light chain.
And the tips of them is where the epitope would stick.
Correct, yeah. And that's why so actually your light chain, half of it is variable, half of it is constant. All right? And then this part of the heavy chain, this part is variable. So these two things are variable because they're going to be specific for a specific epitope. But this is a constant region. Other questions? All right, now, the last thing is Hodgkin and non-Hodgkin. I'm going to compare both of these. First off. Now, when we're talking about Hodgkin, usually we're talking about B cells that are involved. When we're talking about non-Hodgkin, that could be B cells, T cells, or NK cells. But we're talking about a lymphoid malignancy here, right? Because all of these are from the lymphoid line. Hodgkin is going to be really within the lymphatic system, at least in its early stages. non-Hodgkin is gonna really be happening in bone marrow, liver, and GI tract in its early stages. So non-Hodgkin is more starting outside of that lymphatic system, where Hodgkin is happening within the lymphatic system. Very good with that? Now, when we're talking about Hodgkin, because it's really starting within this lymphatic system, it's fairly predictable in its progression. For this one here, and we can think of this predictability as, they call it contiguous. It has this very predictable pattern that you're going to see with Hodgkin. This one is non-continuous. It doesn't have a very predictable pattern at all. All right. In regards to this predictability of Hodgkin disease, you have these stages. You have stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, and of course, as we move down these stages, this is where it's getting worse, all right? In stage 1, you're gonna have, I think this is the diaphragm, sort of. To think about this. So in stage 1, you're going to have like 1 or 2 lymph nodes affected above the diaphragm. All right? Usually it's above the diaphragm, because this is a pretty predictable malignancy, a lymphoma. And then in stage 2, you're going to have at least 2 or more lymph nodes affected. But they're going to still be above the diaphragm. Then as Hodgkin progresses, you're going to see in 3 that you have 3 or more. And the key here is above and below diaphragm. All right? And then the 4th one is actually where you're going to start to see these tumors. And that's what I'm really referring about with these lymph nodes. They're tumors within the lymph nodes. And 4 tumors are going to be outside now of the lymphatic system. Okay? And so it has this predictable pattern or staging that occurs with Hodgkin, which does not happen with non-Hodgkin. The other thing with Hodgkin versus non-Hodgkin, this is harder to treat because it's not as predictable, but it also doesn't have any really non-specific symptoms or signs, okay? So non-Hodgkin, it doesn't have what's called B symptoms, but the B symptoms are, has no B symptoms, which is fever, weight loss.
So like non-specific
Yeah.
kind of stuff?
Uh-huh. Like those non-specific symptoms are really the B symptoms here. Think of it that way. But this guy doesn't have that, okay? No. Or this one does. So if we think about it, this one, you can really quickly find out if someone has Hodgkin. Or they start to have these manifestations, like, oh, they have a fever, weight loss, stuff like that, and they have swollen lymph nodes. That makes it much easier to acknowledge that someone has Hodgkin. And since it is such a predictable pattern, it also makes it easier to treat than non-Hodgkin. Since non-Hodgkin it could essentially happen in anywhere in the body. It's typically in the bone or the liver, bone marrow, or the liver. but it doesn't have any symptoms really associated with it. And so what ends up happening with people that have non-Hodgkin, these B cells, T cells, and NK cells, which don't have anaplasia, they look fine, there's just a bunch of them, will start to accumulate in blood vessels and blocking blood vessels, which can become a really serious problem. So in this one, you get from lots of these blood, either B cell, T cell, or NK cells proliferation here. You get obstruction of, and in particular, the superior vena cava. You can also have obstruction of the spinal cord. Eek. So once you get to this manifestation, though, you're already in serious trouble. All right? This one does have anaplasia. So the other thing that makes this easier to find out if you have Hodgkin disease is you get these cells that are called Reed-Sternberg, I think it's Reed-Sternberg cells. And the way they look is, it looks like, almost like there's two cells inside of a cell, these Reed-Sternberg cells. And so they can definitely like look at your blood and look at your leukocytes, and if they see these, that means that you have Hodgkin as well. And that's it.
So why the superior vena cava? Is it coming from like the head, neck, or chest area, or what's going on with that?
I would imagine because it's a low pressure.
Okay.
It's a really low pressure in that superior vena cava. And that might be one of the reasons why you're getting obstruction of that superior vena cava.
So it's not necessarily anything that's above or below the diaphragm because it's everywhere, really, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to see it in the liver, which is actually dealing with the inferior vena cava.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not 100% sure why you don't see an obstruction there. So, and some of these things, they figure out, oh, okay, this is a common thing that's happening. And then they have to like do research to find out the why. And maybe they've done research on the why right now. Maybe that's something that they have to figure out, well, why is it the superior vena cava, which would be great,
Mm-hmm.
because then that would help them potentially to diagnose this, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the key with this one, though, is it doesn't have these symptoms. That's a big one. And it's outside of the lymphatic system as well. And so you could have a tumor starting with non-Hodgkin, but since it's outside of this lymphatic system, you're not going to have it be visible.
But you would have maybe like bone pain since you have
Maybe because of the
proliferation within
bone
the bone
marrow.
marrow.
But, you know, there are a lot of, I mean, we already know that the acute,
Mm-hmm.
those you're going to have bone pain, and also with the plasma cell,
Mm-hmm.
that will have bone pain as well. So those two will have bone pain, or those three. Like specifically, people that have those have bone pain. I'm not 100% sure if this one would as well.
I'm just
Maybe.
assuming just because
Maybe.
if you have a tumor in your
But
bone.
the thing is white blood cell malignancies are just so
Vast.
vast. They share similar things, and as far as I can tell, that the way they treat them is very similar anyways. You know, chemotherapy, especially if we're talking about a leukemia, you're going to have to do chemotherapy because that's circulating
Mm-hmm.
one. If it's a lymphoma, but that's usually a later stage, right? Most of the time, except for Hodgkin, actually. Lymphoma is a later stage in that white blood cell leukemia. So it's already been a circulating tumor. So doing radiation therapy isn't really gonna do the trick. I think chemotherapy is what they do. I mean, as they learn more about these white blood cell malignancies, they can come up with better treatments. And of course, the bone marrow transplant, I'm sure, can be helpful in some of these. That's it. Did you guys study this weekend? Yes.
So I noticed, I did my practice exam, but there's no key for it.
I don't do that until tonight. I want you to try to find the correct answers
And I
on your
did it
own,
for
and then I'll
exam.
post the key up tonight.
So are you using that for as like homework stuff that you said?
Oh,
I
thank
think
you.
that was the quiz review.
I am gonna take down your names for the homework.